I even know what the hell I'm talking about or going to talk? Do I even know what I'm doing? Most of the time, the answer is no. I'm sitting out here journaling about witchcraft, like I do, okay? And I'm thinking about, somehow the journaling session has turned into witch versus craft. Instead of witchcraft total, it has shifted, it has transformed into trying to figure out what witch is and then what craft is. Which is pretty crazy for me, because I always seem to think that, you know, if you are a witch, you do witchcraft. And that's the full extent of it. And then whatever I may put in my journals, books of mirrors, the magical thoughts that I have, they go down on record, making it all seem like one thing. One big idea. Witchcraft being one big umbrella idea. And somewhere along the line, the journaling session started talking about witch being how I identify. And then craft is how somehow, you know, the craft, it's craft, not witchcraft. The craft is what I do, my unique perspective, my witch identity. That's that witch identity's perspective. It's unique. It's like a fingerprint. And the journaling has taken on a life of its own. Being a witch and identifying as such, what does that mean? Does that mean that because I call myself a witch and I live witchcraft, that's all it needs to be? I don't have to do the craft to identify as the witch. I can just live it like a lifestyle. It's the life I'm living. It's the magic that I see. It's the magic that I perceive, right? And then it, like I said, the journaling session kind of keeps transforming. It's shape shifting as I'm doing this shit. And somehow it turned into, well, if you're living the life and you're identifying as this, but you're not doing this craft, you're not doing the craft, the versus here, the craft, how could you possibly call yourself a witch? Real good question. Good question. I think largely like this, I'm just asking questions to myself. Sometimes I don't get to an answer, but I think I've landed on the fact. I've kind of landed here. I've kind of hovered here at the helipad on witch as my identity, as how I identify. Even if I don't do anything, I know that I am one. Without having to do a fucking thing. Without doing anything, I am one. But why? How? How did that come about? And I actually want to go in depth in this, in a project that I've got going on. It's pretty exciting. Can't wait for y'all to learn about that. But I'm going to be diving into a little bit of my magic and witchcraft and my witchcraft dreams. Like the ambitions of my witchcraft and being identifying as such in a vow of personal gnosis. So that project will be announced, I don't know, sometime soon. And I want to go into this, but ever since I was a little girl, the witch as an identity has always been what I want to be. And even when I knew in childhood that I was one, even when I knew somehow that I would identify as that someday, even though I didn't know the words, I didn't know the way to describe it, I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't doing my craft, my unique, I wasn't putting anything in my unique perspective. I was just living my life internalizing magic, perceiving magic, allowing myself to have an open mind with lots of different things, ingraining myself into various things that I would bring my magic into. So I was bringing my magic, myself, my life into the essence of being a witch. I was putting myself in those things as a witch, but I wasn't doing anything with that. I was just bringing myself to the identity as a witch, living that life. And that doesn't mean that I was living an aesthetic, because I wasn't. I was, I mean, I wasn't allowed to outwardly project that anyway in terms of an expression, like with jewelry or with clothing. I mean, I wasn't allowed to express myself in those ways growing up, but then, living that, knowing that, and then I have, throughout childhood and adolescence, I had this vision of what witch meant to me, specifically to me, without reading any books, without knowing really what it really was going to mean someday to be one. It's like it lived inside of me. And that's what identity as a witch meant to me, is that with everything I see, with all the pain and all the suffering and all the joy and happiness that I'll find through my life, I'm going to come at it as a witch without doing anything. Nothing. In my being. It's just in my being. I don't know if that's going to make sense. But like I said, it's not really the aesthetic. It's more how I approach life, how I want to approach life, how open I want to be, how aligned I want to be. You could say that paganism did have a role in the identity as a witch too, that I was mostly pagan, but there was an identity. There was. Now, granted, growing up, I didn't know that I was pagan, didn't even know what the hell that was. But this relationship I had with nature was, to me, always broader than just plain paganism. It was broader, and it was more in tune. But I was in tune with nature, and then I was always mirroring that with myself, mapping myself out with nature. Now, sure, that could be called paganism, like I said, as an umbrella term, but there was always some kind of being. You could call it the fetch, you could call it a soul being, whatever, but there was this being living there that knew I was a witch. That was basically identifying myself for me in this very call, in the call of this void that I felt in times of emptiness, in times of great sorrow. I remember one time, I was like 17, okay, I'm not going to get into any detail right now, but I was 17, my heart was broken, okay, and I was in the car, I think I was driving to work, actually, and this feeling came over me because of my heart breaking. When your heart is breaking, or when you have a broken heart, and you're in the actual deep throes of it, your heart vessel, the organ itself, actually hurts. I think that's why it's called heartbreak. There was a heaviness, right? And I remember feeling 1,000 pounds, my heart feeling 1,000 pounds. I could feel it throbbing in my ears, throbbing in my hands on the steering wheel. And this wave rolled through me like, this is what heartbreak is. And it was just like this drumbeat of a heartbeat, but a message on the web. Your heart is breaking. And you're not dying. You're not dying. This isn't killing you. And it was like this soul voice that was telling me, fuck, you're alive right now. God, I haven't told that story in a long time. That was the witch in me as my identifier. This those times where you get a lesson and you don't know what it is. It's grace. It's grace. It's called grace. Those lessons, you don't know where they come from. But the witch, as my identifier, is my grace. That's some powerful shit right there. Damn, I haven't thought about that in a while. Anyway, as this witch living in me, or whatever you want to call it, how I identify, it's the way in which I see the clouds, it's the way in which I see nature, it's the way in which I see myself through certain times. And I don't have to do a damn thing. I'm just living my life, going through the motions, and I'll get this wave. Fuck, you're alive, and you're a witch. Fuck, you're alive, and you're a witch. This is kind of like what it is. It's kind of like this, like I said, slow heartbeat. That's always there. It always has been. And then getting into the craft. I don't want to talk forever. I could talk forever about loving being a witch and living it and identifying as it, okay? But once I got into journaling, okay, well, the craft as something separate, right? The separate entity. It is actually what I do, actually what I perform, actually what I see. And then when I see something and I know, if I'm responding, it's my response to the soul call. It's my response to the void. It's my conversation, my active conversation. I picked up the phone. And by me picking up the phone to the identifier in me that's a witch, I then craft. I craft something. I craft something in this conversation I have with her. I see the wind blowing right now. And it's my witch is calling. Fuck, you're alive and you're a witch. And I'll go, yeah, you're right. Let's do some fucking magic. Let's do some magic, bitch. And that's what I do. Bring my unique perspective along with this identifier. And that's my craft. It's how I want to respond to my life. Thought a lot about this actually since this kind of like crafty thing. The craft as an identity, or I mean the craft as a dedication in terms of like my unique the dues I'm gonna do. The duty. I'll say the duty. The duty I have to the identity as of a witch. I do have a duty. I've been thinking about this a lot, or I was gonna say, I think I've been thinking about this a lot since my magic video came out, magic having a price, because that video really turned me on my axis. Because now some may say that, you know, it sounded a lot like I was talking about like my practice specifically, but what it really was me asking questions to myself, because that's mainly what my journaling is. My journaling is, I'll journal and then I'll literally write questions down to think about, to ruminate. I may not always get an answer. That's not the point for me. The point is that I'm asking myself open-ended questions to be able to permeate something into there. The question is a void, a pocket void. And the question sits there as its own thing, and then I choose whether to acknowledge it as the witch, as an identifier, or craft something with it. and it's my choice. That's why I pose myself these questions, because I'm at the end of the day, I'm like, okay, I acknowledge that question. I'll think about that. You know, I'm glad I asked myself that. I'm glad it's out there and in my book, okay, in my record. But I might not have to actually do something with it. I might not have to ingrain it into my practice, into my craft. So, let me get a sip of coffee. Yeah, one thing that I think about in terms of craft, in terms of the unique perspective that I'll bring to this identifying being that is me. You know, well, I guess it's always good for us witches to do this, but think about what it is you actually do. I mean, labels they're good for some things, okay? But it actually helps you to track what the fuck you're actually doing, what this unique perspective, if this perspective is yours and you're doing something. I got a perfect example right here. I had this out with me earlier. This rusted nail, this rusted railroad nail that I was gonna do something with it. I can't remember now. I was gonna do something with this. Oh, it was protection. Something to do with protection. I was gonna get the rust off of this, and then basically do some folk magic. Okay, and I got to thinking, where the fuck did that come from? I saw it. I actually it was buried in my yard, and I think one of us ran over it with a lawnmower once, and I was like, what the hell is this doing in the yard? You know, like, it was from years and years and years, just, you know, buried through erosion or whatever. And I grabbed it, and I just felt this pull to it, right? And I got to thinking, and then when I wanted to do something with it, get the rust off, and I had like this very folksy, traditional witchcraft thing I wanted to do with it. And then I got to thinking, why the fuck do I want to do that? Where did that come from? You know, the whole rust thorn thing, in terms of protection magic. So I started looking that up instead of asking myself that question and looking it up and getting down to the roots. And I did feel the pull to the rust. And once I was like looking it up and looking up like Appalachian folk magic and things like that, I was like, you know, in my childhood, my parents did talk about the protective properties of rust. We had a horseshoe. For a long time, we had a horseshoe on the door, stuff like that. And my parents were extremely Christian, okay? But there were some things, folksy things that we did that I had forgotten. And so I think about that stuff, but I think about what it is that I do when I'm bringing this unique perspective into the witch, into the craft being this unique perspective. I think about the rites that I perform, the rituals that I perform, albeit low magic rituals that I perform, practices that I have, like cycles that I want to keep in my, you know, practice. Where'd they come from? Which tradition is it from? You know, is it traditional witchcraft? Is it folk witchcraft? If it's folk witchcraft, which folk is it? Which folks? Which peoples are it from? You know, like, I think about the Scottish. Actually, to be honest, a lot of my folk witchcraft could be construed as Scottish folk magic and Irish folk magic. I do have ancestry in both of them. Mostly Scottish, and but I'm a mutt. I'm a fucking mongrel, you know? So who really fucking knows at the end of the day what my real ancestry is? But which tradition does it come from? Because I promise you it probably comes from something. And then even if you want to keep that, I'm not saying you do this kind of identity kind of work to say, oh, well, that's from there, so I don't need that. You can have whatever the fuck you want in your, but it's nice to know the history. It's nice to know where it came from. And it's kind of nice when memories pop up and you're like, yeah, my parents did talk about this and it was weird, you know? And then I got to thinking, okay, well, when I do have certain things, like I said, practices, rites, rituals, the way in which I conduct celebrations, sabbats, espits, things like that. If I do, I say espits in my videos a lot as like a, you know, this full moon kind of ritual things. But to me, espits are what you do in covens. So I need to find another word for that besides espit, besides this full moon big ritual you do with a coven, with a group. As a solitary practitioner, I'm not sure if it's the same thing. So I need to look into that to be respectful of coven people. But when thinking about what I actually do, this unique perspective, conversational perspective I have with witch as my craft, okay, does cosmology and ontology play a role? Because, like, if I believe in land, sea, and sky, that's a Scottish folk tradition. That comes straight out of Scottish cosmology, right? I was actually reading a witchcraft book, and that talked about land, sea, and sky, and blah, 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 blah. And I got to thinking, you didn't even tell us that this was a very specific form of folk magic. The book just went into land, sea, and sky as it was like gospel. Sometimes witchcraft books do that, especially if you're coming from the author's perspective. And it's nice, okay, that they have their own perspective and they know what it is, but sometimes it is nice to look it up, like for the author to be like, yeah, I believe this about cosmologically, and it comes from here, you know. I think researching the history of witchcraft, or researching peoples, researching folk tales, folk peoples, traditions is a fucking can get convoluted. But anyway, does cosmology and ontology being like what you believe, okay, largely it means what you believe. And then I got to thinking, you know, if cosmology is what you believe in terms of like the creation of the universe, what the universe is, what magic is, what things are, you know, does belief versus knowing make a difference? Because belief, to me, and I've read this several times before, belief implies that you can't intrinsically know something. You can believe in it. It's faith-based, right? Like, I can believe that the universe happened after the Big Bang 14 million years ago, right? And it can be backed up by facts. I can believe it, but it's faith-based. It's science and faith-based. Even if something is backed up with a fact scientifically, I still believe that belief is faith-based. I'm believing these resources. I'm believing the science. And does that mean that I'm not leaving room for magic if I do that? But then to know something is different. To know something is, I intrinsically, like my witch, like identifying as a witch, I know this. I don't believe in it. I know it. It's intrinsically me, no matter what I believe. It is me, and I am it. And it is a knowing, not a belief. I think about this whole chaos magic thing about belief being a tool, right? I think it is. I think that that's something powerful that we do, is believe. When we believe in something, we give it power. When we believe in something cosmologically, ontologically, we're giving it faith, and we're giving it power, and we're blowing magic into it. I I just see so much of my unique perspective coming from so many pockets of things. You know, I like Scottish, I like Irish folk tales and folk tradition. I like incorporating some of those aspects into my magic, into my craft, right? But then I also know that I have to have some forms of Appalachian, okay, it's Appalachian. Colloquially, for me, it is Appalachian, not Appalachian. And it's a colloquialism. We all say it different down here in the South. If I go up to North Carolina, they're going to say it different. But Appalachian folk, because of regionalism, because I see that wildlife, I see and interact with those trees and those plants that are linked to this land here that I live on and that I've grown up on. The oak, the pine, the fucking acorn, the blackthorn, the daisy, the yellow daisy is actually linked to my state alone. It doesn't grow anywhere else. Certain wildlife that lives here down in the South that doesn't live anywhere else, you know? Not a lot of them, okay? But so Appalachian folk traditions have to play a role in my craft somewhat because of regionalism and stuff like that. You know, the spirits that I notice, they're part of Appalachian. What is it that I utilize? If my craft is my unique conversation and perspective, my outward projecting of this conversation I'm having with the identifying being that is me, that I know is me, I don't know. It's just, where did the being that is in me that I identify as a witch, where did it come from? I think that it has handprints of ancestors on it. The ancestors each have a hand on this being that lives inside of me as an identity. And the spirits play a role too. Spirits play a role. And my own magic play a role. And then the way I perceive that psychologically, see, I'm like using all the magical models there, but and then the way I, in terms of like, belief, in terms of belief and knowing, and psychologically, I'm projecting that outward into this unique practice, craft. It's all intrinsically linked, but I can separate them. So, okay. I think I'll go back to journaling now. Let me know what you think about witch and craft. Have a nice day. Much love.